Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Mustafa Jimale. I'm with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and we're gonna get started in a couple of minutes. We're just gonna wait for folks to log in. Yeah, we'll just give it one more minute and then we'll get started after that. So welcome everyone. Again, my name is Mustafa Jimale. I'm the policy manager at the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, otherwise known as BAJI. And thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar. This month, we're looking at the plight of Black migrants at the border. I'm joined by my colleagues here. Hold on a second. So feel free to follow us on social media as we have this conversation today. And so throughout the webinar, feel free to submit your questions on the group chat. If you have any issues, feel free to directly inbox me or my colleague, Emanuela, who's gonna be helping facilitate the Q&A part of this webinar. So that's me, I'm Mustafa again. I'm the policy manager and the moderator for this webinar. And we're joined by my colleague, Nana Gyamfi, who's the executive director of BAJI. I'll give Nana a second to introduce herself.
Greetings, folks. So very happy to see that we have so many people that have joined this webinar. I'm really excited to talk about what is happening with African migrants in Tapachula and the work that we have been doing and that we are continuing to do there. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yes. And we are also joined by Kendrick Sampson, who's an actor and activist. Kendrick, do you wanna introduce yourself quickly?
I think you did a good job. I'm Kendrick Sampson. I'm an actor and I'm an activist. I've been working with BAJI a bit and amplifying the amazing work that they're doing.
Wonderful. And then lastly, my colleague, Emanuela.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. If you have any questions or any tech issues, please feel free to contact me directly. And my email, I'll just drop it in the chat box just so you guys have it as well. Thank you.
Awesome. So we'll get right into it. As you guys know, for the past couple of years and more intensely the past couple of months, we've had a bunch of Black migrants at the border who are experiencing a host of issues. Kendrick, Nana, and other members of the BAJI team have been actively doing work down there. And so this webinar is really to get an update on what they've seen firsthand, how the toxic immigration policies the administration is pushing has impacted Black immigrants, and what you can do to help. So with that, I'm just gonna play a quick video that describes the work that Nana, Kendrick, and others are doing at the border.
BAJI recently organized a delegation to Tapachula, Mexico, because we learned that Black immigrants are being held in Tapachula. BAJI works closely with Black immigrants at the U.S.-Mexico border in Tijuana, and while working there, we learned that many Black immigrants were not able to make the journey to Tijuana because they were forcibly being held.
We went to the detention center, Siglio 21 Detention Center. There are about 3,000 African migrants that are in Tapachula right now. Those migrants are represented by an assembly which they put together themselves. These African migrants have left their countries because of persecution there that they're experiencing.
Based on their ethnicity, based on political opinion, based on gender identity, sexual identity, to experience as many human rights abuses as they have during their migration and their journey to the United States to seek safety is really heartbreaking.
It's a situation that they've got to get out of, but the Mexican government won't let them.
Yeah, and so Nana, do you want to kind of quickly describe this clip that we're going to see next?
Yes, so as you saw from the video, this is a humanitarian crisis that combines all of the issues that we talk about as Black folks in this country and globally, and especially and particularly as Black migrants, issues that deal with anti-Blackness, that deal with power, that deal with global powers clashing with each other, that deal with the ways in which the actions of the United States and the West affect our countries and what people end up having to do as a result. And so wanting people to get a little better understanding and knowledge base as far as what has been happening and what led us to go to Tapachula, we started getting calls, direct WhatsApp messages from folks who were on the ground in Tapachula about August 23rd, 24th, saying, hey, something is happening here and it's different. So Black migrants have been coming in to Tapachula, through what they call the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, to come to the United States. And that had been happening pretty regularly since 2015, mainly talking about Haitian folks. And then beginning at the beginning of this year, especially, a little bit last year, but the beginning of this year, especially in February, they started to see Black folks coming from the continent of Africa. And that was something that was very different. Those folks happened to come in around the same time that the Trump administration began to put pressure on Mexico to hold people, migrants who are trying to come through to the United States in Mexico. And so these African migrants got caught in that crossfire. They ended up in Tapachula and have been in Tapachula, Mexico, which is at the southern border of Mexico, nearest to Guatemala. Some have been there for months. Some have been there since they started coming in March and April. And of course, there are new folks coming in every day. And they find themselves trapped. And we're going to talk later about why that is and how that is. But they're not being allowed by the Mexican government to leave Tapachula and come north. If they try to leave Tapachula, they are rearrested if they're found, taken back to Tapachula, and put into the detention center there. And so they're stuck there, unable to leave, and they decided that they had enough. And so we started getting calls around the 24th of August saying, something's happening differently here. These African migrants are organized, they're organizing themselves, and they have decided that they're going to begin to engage in protests. So we started getting video, again, directly from the ground of what those protests look like. And so what you're gonna see next is some of the some clips, a couple clips that are showing the types of protests and demonstrations that folks are getting into. Just be mindful that we actually have lots of different videos, but we really were trying to be secure and safe for people in terms of what we showed and with confrontations with the police or with the National Guard. But this gives a pretty good sense of what kind of protests African migrants have been engaged in. So we can play that, Mustafa.
Okay. Oops, sorry. Sorry about that.
And so that's just an example of the type of protest that folks have engaged in the streets of Tapachula. What you saw there were our siblings, brothers, sisters, folks who are gender non-conforming all together from the African continent who have been engaging in protests there. They have been walking in the streets there. They also have been protesting by laying their bodies on the street in front of Siglio 21. You heard me reference that in the initial video. That is the detention shelter there. It is the largest detention shelter, and I'm using that word specifically for a reason, in Latin America. They don't refer to their detention prisons and cages in Mexico or in any of the countries of the Northern Triangle as detention centers. They describe them as shelters, but as we'll talk about later, that's really not what they are. And so the African Assembly got together on August the 29th. The African migrants formed an assembly, and they issued demands. You see a copy of the demand letter right there, in which they described what their situation was, what they had to go through to get to Mexico, what they were experiencing in Mexico, and their singular demand, which was to be able to go freely to the north. They also, next slide, engaged in a press conference that lasted 45 minutes in which they announced their assembly and were able to describe for journalists there in Mexico and international journalists what their plight was. These are 15 different countries that are represented. They include Ethiopia, Eritrea, Ghana, Senegal, Cameroon, Congo, Angola. They have the list there on that letter, and we can, I'm sure, get you copies if you'd like to see it. All of these countries having come together, they voted country by country on representatives and formed this assembly. And so that is sort of in a nutshell, a description of the overall crisis, African migrants trapped by policy in Tapachula, Mexico, forming an organization, an assembly, engaged in protest. And we wanted to be able to talk to you about what their experience is there and why we are in support of them being able to leave Tapachula. And so for that, I'll pass it back to Mustafa so Kendrick can give us that information.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, Kendrick, do you want to kind of describe the next video of the Angolan woman that you interviewed?
Oh, this is the Angolan woman. Let me just, yeah, go ahead, Kendrick, sorry.
What were you gonna say?
So we had we were able to interview people on the ground about what was happening and why they were there and what was going on. And so this is an interview that in which Kendrick interviewed this Angolan woman who describes her journey. And if you could just let us know a little bit about this woman, because she was pretty phenomenal. This clip just describes her journey, but if you could tell us a little more about her.
Yeah, she was an activist in Angola, and she was fighting for women's rights, and she describes her journey, which you will hear. And I think I don't want to ruin that for you, I guess, but she was very, as you'll see, very what's the best way to describe her? She excuse my French, she didn't take no shit. She's strong, and she made sure that she got her family there. You might see, I'm not sure exactly what this clip is, but you might see a little bit of surprise on my face as she describes not only what happened on her journey, but who she brought with her on her journey. And many of the migrants that we interviewed described the same treacherous journey. And I don't think she really gets into details, but there are, as they travel through several countries, over an ocean, and then through several countries up into the southern border of Mexico. Now, as we've been described many times, the southern border of the US is now the southern border of Mexico. They had to encounter a lot of dead bodies and violence and being robbed and such. And so it just makes her journey and who she traveled with much, much more impactful and powerful. And you'll see that she was a leader, and she is a leader, and it's very apparent.
Okay. Oopsie. Let's see here.
A minha jornada a partir de Angola foi de avião, chegando de avião até o Equador. De Equador a gente começou a vir de ônibus, de bis, autocarro, e de autocarro a gente passou a floresta a gente começou a passando Panamá, Costa Rica, Honduras, a gente pulou até muros e a gente chegou até aqui no México. Inclusive a gente andou de cavalo. Eu saí do meu país porque eu sou ativista, defendendo os direitos da mulher, da igualdade, e eu fui ser perseguida. Eu saí do meu país para salvar a minha vida, por isso que eu tive que sair, eu e a minha família, porque se eu ficar no meu país eu vou ser morta por direito de igualdade. Socorro, socorro. O governo mexicano não está a matar a gente com armas, mas está matando a gente, fazendo sofrer do jeito que a gente está.
So the first part of what she was saying is she was saying that she left Angola by plane. She arrived by plane in the land of Ecuador. Then when she got to Ecuador, they took the bus. From the bus, they took a car. From the car, they got to the forest. That's how they cried it, the floresta, which is really that jungle. From the forest, we passed through Panama, Costa Rica, Honduras. We climbed a wall, and now we're here in Mexico. We even took a horse. In that second part, she describes, I left my country because I'm an activist, defending the rights of women, of equality, and I was chased and had to leave to save my life. Me and my children and my family had to leave because if I stayed in my country, I would be killed for equal rights. And so I just want to stop there. And Kendrick, let's talk a little bit about what we heard from people about why they had left their countries.
Yeah, I also want to add that I thought she was going to say it in that clip. So, you know, there's a whole journey, even through that car and, you know, getting off the plane and getting in a car and getting on before they even get to the forest. It's pretty traumatizing. But when they get to that forest and they travel through that forest, we heard many different accounts of like people having to step over dead bodies, the people that they were traveling with dying in that forest. It's about a 5 to 7 day journey through that forest. And I'd imagine it's going to be on the longer end of that, if not even longer than that for her, because she also revealed in that same interview that she traveled with her 7 kids and her husband. She traveled with 7 kids, 7 children, and her husband. So this was an exceptionally hard journey for her. And she's still there like, and what? I'm here and I still need to, you know, pass through, and they're not allowing me. And a lot of them, as she said, had left their country because of political persecution, because of one of the guys from Ghana describes his family turned against him because he wanted to marry a woman that was of a different religion than him. And so his uncles ended up kidnapping him and tying him to a chair and torturing him. And then his mother had to plead and try to get him out of that situation. And he was told to flee or they would kill him. There were many different stories about mostly, I think, most of the people that we talked to, political persecution in Cameroon and Angola and Senegal, and because of, you know, religion or equal rights or violence, extreme violence, war. So they wanted to be very clear that they were not just seeking better economic opportunities, that they were actually fearful for their lives, and that the reason that they didn't want to stay in Mexico is because they didn't come to Mexico. They didn't come across this crazy, treacherous journey to end up in Mexico, where they're still fearful of a lot of the same things that they were facing in their hometowns. They were still fearful of the crime there and the way they were being treated by the government and political persecution. They just kind of left those conditions to encounter them in Mexico, and they want to pass through and get away from that as well.
Thank you so much, Kendrick. And then Mustafa, we can play the rest of the video. The reason that we are playing this video in folks' own voices, even though they're not in English, and, you know, obviously we'll give you the translation, is because we want to make sure that you hear directly from folks, right? That it's not just a pass through, but you get to hear the passion, the concern, the intonation of people's voices, whether you understand the language or not. We can all feel spirit. And so if we're able, Mustafa, to play the rest of our sister speaking, that would be great.
Unfortunately, this is a shorter version of the full clip, but we can provide people the full clip in a follow-up email.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. And then looking at why or what people experience once they get to Tapachula. As described by our sister and more fully by Kendrick, people have, you know, risked it all, basically. Think of our Angolan sister who has been through all of that, the jungle, climbed the walls, all of those things that they had to do to finally get to Tapachula. And then what is the process? So once you get over that, go over the border into Mexico, you have a certain distance, 20 kilometers, in which you are supposed to go and immediately report yourself that you are there. And then you have paperwork that you fill out there with their border patrol. And then you're taken by INM, which is their ICE, and you are taken to the detention center, Siglio 21. Technically speaking, you shouldn't even be arrested. What we learned from one of the human rights groups there that has been working closely with African migrants, Fray Mateus, is that it is not illegal in Mexico to cross the border without papers, number one. Number two, if you are detained, you are only supposed to be detained for 72 hours. They can't hold you longer than that, which is why they do not refer to their detention centers as detention centers, because technically our siblings are not being detained. Technically, according to the Mexican government, they're being sheltered. This is supposedly helping them. This is something that is supposed to be positive for them. But instead, they are living in these detention centers in conditions that have been described by everyone as completely violative of their human rights, and even described to us personally as being akin to slave ship conditions. Whether you're talking about the food that has maggots in it, whether you're talking about the lack of health care. There was a sister from Cameroon that described that when a sister's on her cycle, that they don't give you any pads or any feminine products, that basically every so often they come through and hand you one, and that's it. If you don't get another one for the next month, you're gonna have to work it out. The sanitation in terms of hygiene, just general regular sanitation issues are horrible. People have died. In August, when I went earlier, a Haitian man had died there at the detention center after being sick for 15 days, left to die in his cell. And we heard so many stories from folks of the ways in which those detention centers were really inhumane. And people remain there while they are processing or being processed by INM, by their ICE, for either a humanitarian visa or for a permanent residency. These migrants are not asking for humanitarian visas, and they're not asking for permanent residency. They're required to do that based on Mexican policy that is the result of US policy. And so when Kendrick said earlier that the southern border of the United States has been extended to the southern border of Mexico, this is the main way that's happened, is that US policy has caused Mexican policy to be different and to change in a way that it wasn't before. You could just go through as a transit person, but now you're required to apply for a humanitarian visa and for permanent residency. And while that happens, you are stuck in the detention center. Once your process goes through, some people, they wait on the outside and they're trying to figure out now, are they gonna get this visa or a permanent residency that they don't even want? Other folks are declared stateless, are told you don't have a state. You came here claiming that your government has persecuted you, and yet we notified your government in our processing that you're here, and we asked them to acknowledge you as a citizen, and because we didn't hear back from them, or because you don't have an embassy here, so we can't even reach your government, we've decided you're not a citizen of your government, and actually you're a citizen of nowhere. And that's one of the main complaints also that the African migrants had, this declaration of statelessness, in spite of the fact that they had documentation proving and showing that they had a state and that they had a country. And so that's just the first part of the process that you have to go through that could take weeks to months, and then you finally are let out of detention. And so if you look at these pictures, while Kendrick can describe just from our own first eyes looking, and from what we heard from people, what their conditions have been while they have been outside of detention.
Yeah, so a lot of them were saying just, that their main struggle was that they don't speak Spanish. Many of them speak many different languages, Spanish not being one of them. Some of them speak Spanish, but for the most part, many of them describe that they don't speak Spanish, and that's a very hard thing. They speak English, they speak French, they speak, and there's no translators. The paperwork that they had to sign to get in, that they were forced to sign to come in as they were begging and pleading to come in. Many of them slept outside for 2 or 3 days waiting to be allowed into the detention center, into Mexico. on the other side in Guatemala. And once they were let in, and then they went through this whole experience that Nana just described, they experienced harsher treatment than other migrants that were in there from Cuba and Honduras. And they said that because they were Black, they noticed a very clear distinction. And many of them, what was really impressive to me, understood that very, very clearly. They expressed very clearly that they understood that the pressure was from Donald Trump and Donald Trump's administration, and that this policy was, the harsher experience that they had was largely because of that. And once they were out of the detention center, even when they experienced like medical problems in the detention center, they would have disproportionate treatment because of the color of their skin. But even when they got out, they had problems when they would go to the store and try to get prescriptions, and people would tell them, that they didn't have it and go away, or people were just very rude to them. And it's hard to navigate that society where you have to speak Spanish and experience racism. And so they were, still being, even though that they weren't being detained in a detention center, they're finally out in the city. They can't pass through the city, and all they want to do is pass through the country to the southern border of the US. And so they're still being detained against their will, and they are still afraid of the crime there. And they have no money. They can't pay rent. They can't, they don't have they're essentially experiencing homelessness there. Not essentially, they are, to a very extreme degree. They can't, their home is across the ocean, and they cross several treacherous circumstances through several countries in order to get there by foot, by plane, by bus, by boat. And then finally experiencing the harsh treatment there, and still not having the proper medical treatment and the proper nourishment, and then being released with no money to experience life in a racist, in racist circumstances where you don't have the tools, including the language, in order to communicate and get anything that you really need.
We saw a lot of children, and I'm hoping that folks are noticing the children that were there. There was a lot of families. They talked to us about the fact, the folks who are doing work in terms of human rights work there in Fray Mateus talked about the fact that it used to be a lot of sort of single men, and then now they have a lot more families, and that with the Black migrants in particular, and in particular the African migrants, that you're finding that a lot of them are coming with other folks. We saw very pregnant, with one sister who was clearly ready to have a baby at any time, other women who were pregnant as well, experiencing like a lack of not just language access, but a lack of healthcare, as Kendrick pointed out, so that you really don't know what's happening. Folks don't necessarily have the funds to be able to cook and do those types of things. You have people communally putting money together and having folks cook under those circumstances, which is beautiful. It's beautiful to see the way in which our folks are not just being resilient, but also resisting and standing up for their human rights and for their humanity. We also saw a lot of militarization. And so we wanted to make sure you also saw these images. This is an image of the Mexican Federales as well as Mexican National Guard, who come every day to protect the detention center because of the demonstrations and their fear that somehow the Africans are going to overtake them and free everybody in the detention centers, and just to have that show of force. Very interesting there, and another conversation for another day. But a lot of the frontline people that are Federales and Mexican National Guard are indigenous, like clearly indigenous folks, and you can see in their eyes that they are confused and not too pleased their darn selves with the position that they find themselves in, many of them having been run off of their land. And, you know, due to corruption in their countries. And so they can kind of feel some of the energy that the African migrants have, but still find themselves on the other side of the line. And so, you know, that's another interesting piece, but it's definitely very heavily militarized. And I know we want to make sure that we have time for people to ask questions, and we're not quite done, but I wanted to just add some of the sentiment that was provided by our sister, you know, describing what it is that they are dealing with and what it is that they are going through. But first, if we go through the pictures, I think we have another video clip that we can show in slide 24 before I talk more about the direct quotes and information that folks were giving us about what their experience in Tapachula has been. So let's go ahead and hear that. This is in English.
I, for one, if I want to go and see the doctor, I have to plead with the security man. You come, they go, come back in an hour time, they come back home, come back in an hour time again. Sometimes they'll tell you the doctor said it's tired, so go tomorrow. These are some of the basic challenges that we are facing over there in India. But it's good to know how to use words of comfort when you are talking to a stranger. It's very important. We don't have it. So sometimes it makes you feel bad as if you are not a human.
That is just a piece of, again, longer interviews that we had done. And Kendrick had interviewed this brother from Ghana who was talking, as you see, about just a little bit of what they have to go through and just that feeling of not being treated as a human being. And so I wanted to just close up this little part with, or this piece of the webinar with the discussions that, and some of the statements that the Angolan sister made that you weren't able to hear. And so she says, help, help. The Mexican government is not killing us with guns, but making us suffer with the way that they're treating us. If the Mexican government is hiding it, let me let you know. They are holding captive thousands and thousands of Africans, thousands and thousands of people from Honduras, thousands and thousands of human beings that need to be free. We want a free transit to cross all of the Mexican territory as we wish, freely, like we are human beings. Here, we are as if we are in prison. We are being treated like beasts. Thought that was very important for us to be able to talk about. This next slide is a picture of us under a tent. They had a tarp because they're just outside in the open, as you saw. And this is rainy season, so it rains every single day. And there are 3,500 African migrants that are in Tapachula. There are hundreds of them who are in that area right in front of the detention center. They've turned that into an encampment, as you saw, with all the tents and everything. And they are afraid to leave because they're sure if they leave that they won't be allowed back in, and then they'll really not have a place to stay. So there's a tarp that they put up, this pink tarp, and under that tarp, it was raining cats, dogs, and everything else, loud. But we were screaming at the top of our lungs, myself, Tsion Gurmu, our comrade Arturo, assisting, giving folks legal advice, answering people's legal questions about asylum in the United States, what the procedure was, the process, how the policies had changed. And you can just see how many people, that's not even all the people, it was just hundreds of people under this tarp being held up by brothers using water bottles, making sure that we had enough space. It was really a moment, and we wanted to make sure to share that moment with you. Next slide. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about the policies that have been used to create what we're calling this invisible wall of agreements, right? So 44 and a half, as I call him, has not succeeded in making an actual wall that he wants to make down in those countries, but he has succeeded by policy and agreements in creating some kind of wall, hurdles that folks have to go through in order to get into this country. So one of them, or three of them at this point, are the third safe country agreements, basically in which other countries, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, are requiring migrants on their way to the United States to seek protections in those countries first. And so Mexico doesn't have an actual agreement, but as you heard me talk about earlier, it does the same thing, right? Even if it doesn't have an actual agreement, requiring migrants first to ask for asylum and to ask for permanent residency in those countries on their way to the United States. Generally speaking, African migrants, Black migrants in general, get rejected because these countries don't want their own Black people, let alone some Black people from somewhere else. But the process that folks have to go through and the suffering that folks have to go through beforehand often is something that is dangerous to their lives. And so it's something obviously that we don't want to have occur anymore. The MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols, this is often referred to as the Remain in Mexico policy. It doesn't affect folks in Tapachula because people don't actually apply until they get further up into Tijuana. And most Black migrants, and definitely the Black migrants there in Tapachula, are not affected by that there, but it's something that they can look forward to as they take that new Underground Railroad trek up north to the border of US and Mexico, that they will not be, they'll have to wait there for their day in US Immigration Court under this policy. And then finally, looking at the asylum ban, which is, similar to the country agreements, or similar provisions that basically say that if in fact you want to come through Mexico and you go through Central America, that you have to apply in the countries there first for asylum before you can come into the United States. And so this is what our siblings have had to go through. This is what our siblings are going through. BAJI remains committed to assisting. We just had our staff attorney and legal manager, Tsion Gurmu, just came back like the early part of this week from Tapachula, having done some legal workshops there. We also donated some tents. People are not trying to stay there, so we're trying to make it so it's not, everything that we're giving there, but really giving what folks are looking for. And so if people are interested in assisting, of course, be in touch with BAJI and let's see what we can do. But we wanted to end with a brother speaking specifically about what it is that the migrants are looking for there.
Nana?
Yes.
Before you go there, did you want to touch on the tariffs? Because they were talking about how Mexico is enforcing this because of the threats to the government. Did you talk about that already?
Briefly, not in that specifics, but those are the main reason. The Mexico decided to go ahead and abide by the United States requirement or desire to have people be required, migrants be required to apply because of the tariffs, because he said, basically, if you don't do this, then we're going to put tariffs against Mexico. And so Mexico complied. And again, the people are very clear about that.
And I just want to double down on what you said about them not wanting their own Black people. I just wanted to double down on that because I traveled to Mexico a couple years ago because they had just included Black people on the census in Mexico who had been there forever. It was the first time in 2016, I believe, including Black people on the census. So there are huge Black communities there who haven't ever felt welcome, who have experienced so much racism. And so just imagine African migrants coming through and what they're experiencing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're going to end this with our brother from the Congo. He's speaking French, but I'll translate quickly after you hear from him, because you got to hear it from him, in terms of what the demand is. And this is demand we heard from all of the African migrants we spoke to about what it is that they want to do. So if we could please play that.
Nous n'avons pas besoin qu'ils nous donnent le manger pour nous faire rêver ici et pour nous faire dormir ici. Nous n'avons pas aussi besoin de leur argent pour nous faire dormir éternellement ici. Nous n'avons pas aussi besoin de toutes leurs propositions qu'ils pourront faire d'une manière ou d'une autre, que ça soit de l'Est, d'Ouest, du Nord au Sud, ce que nous voulons. Qu'ils nous délivrent un document valide et valable pour passer jusqu'à la frontière du Nord pour que les gens se sentent libres.
And so what he says there is, we don't need for them to give us food, to make us wake up here or make us sleep here. We also don't need their money for us to sleep eternally here. We also don't need all of their propositions that they can do in one way or another, whether they come from the East, the West, the North, or the South. What we need is that they deliver to us a document that is viable and valid to pass to the northern border so that people can be free to go where they want. And with that, I think we can close. I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, but we gave you the information that we could before the question and answer, so at least you had all of that under your belt. So thank you so very much.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Emanuela, who's going to facilitate the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to read the question out loud, and then whoever wants to answer from the panel, please feel free to do so. And if you have a question, you can raise your hand in the attendee slot, or you can type it in the Q&A slot as well, or in the chat. So the first question is, are they being held there due to the third country transit regulations?
So in Mexico, they don't have there's not an official agreement between the United States and Mexico. There's an official agreement, that they put together with El Salvador, with Honduras, with Guatemala. Guatemala was first. There's not an official one with Mexico, but the pressure, as we described earlier, with regard to tariffs and other concerns that the Mexican government has about US retaliation, has caused the Mexican government to create a policy within, its own immigration policy that effectively does the same thing.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, what are the ways intersectional organizing, fancy to say, working with each other despite differences and oppression/phobia towards certain groups, is happening among the African migrants? You mentioned that folks fled due to the various reasons, including persecution due to sexual and gender identity.
And Kendrick probably wants to add to this too, because he was talking to way more people, on the side and in the nooks and crannies. But I think it's very fascinating that you have 15 different countries in which people are speaking different colonizer languages, as well as different, indigenous languages of their own, came together to pull this assembly together. And I think that in itself is a pretty big feat. It's hard for us to do that within the cities right here in the United States. One of the things that I think we left them with in terms of an impression was really women's leadership. We really focused on, hey, we need to make sure that we're also interviewing women, that we're talking to women, that you have women at the table. If you notice the picture from the press conference with the African Assembly, there's like one sister there, and she's the daughter of one of the brothers who was elected as a rep. So we did, the women are there, and obviously they're everywhere, and they are speaking up and speaking out. These are women who also have fled and have gone through all, so they're not like wallflowers, all quiet and afraid to say anything. But in terms of giving, like making space for women in leadership, we talked about, the importance of that. And I know that there are folks who were gender nonconforming. My understanding is that there were at least a couple of people who were trans. Some folks were more, sort of in the mix than others, but I know that there also is a concern for some folks of coming out, even amongst the people there that are protesting, because there's nothing about the fact that they're protesting that means that they are, respectful and honoring of the humanity of everyone. But Kendrick, you have anything to add to that?
Not really. I mean, there were people that, I spoke to a lot of people, and there were, we did have to make an effort to continually stress that we want to center women, especially mothers and single women, and we wanted to, to get people to show their faces was a struggle because of a lot of, security concerns and such. But there were also people, there was one guy, I'm like hesitant to say it, but there was one guy that just would not, he would not give his story because he was afraid that other people would, within the migrant community, would not be very happy with him. And so we
gotta leave it at that's the best way to describe it.
Yeah, and he would pull us to the side to make sure that nobody else heard. So there were a lot of people that that had stories that they were hiding because they were scared, even amongst that crowd, and with good reason. And there were gender nonconforming, gay, lesbian, queer folk as well.
Okay. So the next question is, what efforts are available to send supplies, etc., for African migrants there, e.g. feminine products, maybe through a local organization or group that has been formed?
So we are working out some of the, that information. A couple of things. Number one, when you're looking at the groups that are there in terms of shelters, et cetera, there's not a lot of them that actually even accept Black people or that treat Black people well. And so you have so many people that are just living on the street because they're forced to do that. And so there's no like a entity that's there that's giving out these things. But we are speaking with folks on the ground who are part of the African Migrant Assembly to see if we got stuff to them, would they be able to distribute? Because they distribute food already, right? And so it's not like we will make our own way. And so people are doing that. And so seeing how that can happen. And that goes with the second part. They're not trying to stay there. So the Congolese brother, he used a word I had not seen since, 16th century writing, dotage, which is dotage, this idea of storing things that you're not going to use, you're just holding them. And that's what they feel they're in right now. And so they're not trying to get set up in places where now they're going to, it's going to be a kinder, gentler trapping, right? They're not trying to have that scenario, but as well are still trying to survive. So we're trying, we're working with them to figure out specifically in terms of supplies, in terms of funds, what do they think makes sense? How would they like to see it set up? and then figure out how we can do it from there. So again, please keep close attention to BAJI on our social media platforms so that you can get the information as soon as we do about how we can work that part.
Okay. The next question is, have you been in touch with embassies here in New York City? For example, the Angolan, and what can we do to help?
So part of the issue, what we did as BAJI is one of the first things we did in terms of international pressure is to send a letter to the Organization of American States, OAS, which was having a conference about corruption, a meeting about corruption in DC. And so we sent that physically as well as digitally, and are trying to pursue pressure in that way to get those countries to pressure Mexico, in terms of these regional countries, to pressure Mexico and the United States about what is happening with African migrants in Tapachula. These migrants are fleeing their countries, saying that their countries are persecuting them. So it's actually a danger, number one, to even have them identified to their embassies, a danger for their families that are still back home. And then secondly, clearly these countries are not trying to say, yes, we persecute people. It's different when people are coming because of natural disaster, or because of something that the government can separate itself from, violence that the government can separate itself from. But in the case of African countries, generally they're complaining about what the government is doing or what the government is allowing to be done to them, and therefore the governments are not being helpful. And the embassies represent the government.
Okay, thank you. And the next question, it says, I would like to hear more about civil society organizations, faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, and what are they doing to help? And this will probably come up later. What are the key things we can do as individuals and activists to start to change this situation?
So Kendrick, again, please chime in to add if there's anything that I missed. But Fray Mateus is one group that is doing a lot to assist the African migrants, providing space for the assembly to meet, helping, with technical support for the formation of the assembly, organizing the press conference, helping them to get their letter together, because obviously these people are not walking around with computers, helping them to get the letter together, to get the letter out, taking their concerns and issues with respect to African migrants to various meetings and discussions, both regionally, with the Mexican government, everywhere that they can, given their limited resources, because all of the civil service organizations working for migrants or on behalf of migrants there are totally overwhelmed and underfunded in an extreme degree. And so that's one thing that's happening. There's a group, Comar, which is kind of like a legal aid of immigration in a way. And people have mixed feelings about them, but they are processing people, which is what enables people to be able to get out of detention, or at least to, be in the system to potentially get a pass or something that allows them to go up north. And then there are, like, the Jesuits are there. And so there's some work that they're doing. There's a couple of shelter groups that are there, but really, which is why we, really felt that, we were called by people that are there on the ground to participate. There's really not folks that are specifically focused on Black migrants. And a lot of the Black migrants that are there, especially African migrants, are kind of wary and not really trusting of all of these entities. And so there's some work to be done there, but the biggest civil service organization that does work on behalf of the African migrants is the African Assembly, created by the migrants themselves.
The only thing I'll add is that they're not organizations that are focusing on African migrants, but I think the most important part of that is that they are not equipped properly to help, translate and and help them the way they need to be helped. And yeah, so our the migrants are not trusting because of the treatment that they've experienced.
And some of the help that we're trying to do from the outside, and there's other orgs too, so I definitely don't want to make it seem like BAJI is the only one. But it's like, if you know how to speak French and Portuguese, Creole, Amharic, Tree, if you know how to speak various languages that can help our folks, we're thinking of, can we have a translation circle? These different groups have said yes, it would be great for them to be able to use WhatsApp, hop on the phone, and have someone that can help them translate, right? And so, if folks were going down there, are people willing and interested to come down and spend a couple days there at least with us? There may be people that are willing to do more, right? Be there for 3 months, for half a year, and really work in the trenches assisting our people. So, we want to work with our, with our siblings in Tapachula, but also to work with our siblings in the United States to figure out what it is that we can do and be of the most help given what it is that we have to offer.
And there was a question as to what people could do, like in general, that if you can't make it all the way down to Tapachula, or obviously these organizations need money, and more than anything, they need personnel. But from what I remember, but they need money, and they also, the migrants want pressure to be applied to the U.S. government and the Mexican government. And so amplify their stories, make sure that you're challenging yourself and other people to be including their stories as much as possible in social media and in media, and also be pressuring the U.S. and Mexican government to be allowing them passage through and eventually into the U.S.
And, as I keep saying, and I know I sound like a little bit like a broken record, but follow us, follow BAJI, follow Build Power, look at the things that, look up for things and opportunities to be able to sign on to petitions, opportunities to be able to maybe make your own video, and we create a video compilation that we then send to the UN, the Mexican government. Let's work together and pay attention to what we're doing, so that we can push this in a, build some power in this effort to assist our folks. And when Tsion went, one of the things she came back, she's like, hey, they want to know, are you still letting people know what their demands are? Are you still pressuring? And so we want to be able to continually say with all honesty, yes, that's still happening.
Okay. So our next question, it says, hello, thanks so much for this presentation. I'm wondering what justification the Mexican government is giving for not allowing African migrants to travel north. Is this justification written in a formal policy or law anywhere? In addition, do you know if there are any legal actions moving forward in Mexican courts/agencies to challenge this policy?
So it's a policy. It's not something that just affects Black migrants or African migrants. Everyone that's coming through has this same, or at least Central Americans also. Let me add that, because I'm sure the French are not, suffering this issue. But Central American migrants are also going through the same, policy-wise, the same issue. Of course, the difference is that, and again, when we say Central Americans, let me be very clear, we're not talking about Black Central Americans. Black Central Americans, of course, are complaining about the same racism and anti-Blackness that the other Black migrants are complaining from Haiti and the continent of Africa. So they're, being in the same boat. Difference being, at least they speak Spanish, right? So at least they speak the language, but they're still suffering from anti-Blackness as well. But, so the policy is the same, but it's not having the same impact. It disproportionately negatively impacts Black migrants, and in particular, the Black migrants they refer to as extracontinental, right? So the Black migrants that are coming from Haiti and that are coming from the continent of Africa. But you have Asian folks who are also going through the same thing. If you come through that triangle, this is what you are experiencing. And so they're experiencing it too, but again, it's not in the same degree, to the degree that they are not Black migrants.
Thank you.
And then challenges, you have groups like Fray Mateus and others who are challenging they don't just track human rights abuses and help folks in that kind of way, but they also do help people with their court cases, but also do court cases against these human rights abuses. They are so underfunded. I mean, they're not like the ACLU with $26 million coffers to be able to run around filing lawsuits. And so I know that they're not engaged in that type of impact litigation work. And I know there are people that are speaking with folks within the government to try to push back on the policy, but it doesn't seem that the kind of litigation plus legislation plus demonstration kind of work that we do here in the US is not playing out that way in Mexico.
Thank you. The next question, when is the next visit to the border / Tapachula to visit the African migrants? Are observers welcome to go with you, and under what conditions?
So we have work that we do at Tijuana, which Tsion mentions in the video that was at the very beginning. And at Tijuana, we're going there the first Saturday of every month. You can reach out to BAJI, Brother Tadios Bele. Dr. Tadios Bele is our LA clinic coordinator, and he's the person that's coordinating those trips to Tijuana. You can reach him at Tadios, Tadios, at baji.org if you are interested in assisting with the Tijuana work. With respect to Tapachula, yes, I don't want to use the word observers, except maybe in that international human rights conversation, right? So it's not that we're just going and looking at people, but if folks are interested in going themselves and being able to, sort of have firsthand understanding to be able to, or secondhand understanding to be able to help in the pushes that we need to push, then that's something that we can talk about doing. We're still scheduling our next meeting given our own capacity, our next trip, given our own capacity. And that's another piece. We will be setting up a way for folks to donate so that we are able to do this work. I mean, most funders in this country are donating, are giving money for work you do in this country. So we're, not necessarily funded to do this work. This is work that we're doing because it must be done. And so, to the degree that people can assist us with that, with financial resources, that helps and enables us to take delegations of people where maybe we can cover part of the cost and you cover part, and then we're able to go down.
Thank you. The next question, what was the response to the Assembly's demand from the Mexican government? Are there local activist groups in Mexico working with BAJI / working on this issue?
Kendrick, you wanted to handle the first part of the question?
Say it again.
Did you want to handle the first part of the question? Because they were supposed to.
The question again? Say the question, the first part of the question again.
What was the response to the Assembly's demand from the Mexican government?
I think that at one point the short answer is that they gave them the runaround. From what I remember,
yes.
They told them that they would open a new detention center, which was kind of a scary process because it was out of. Tapachula is not a big city. It's a very small place. And there are very few protections in terms of like visibility for migrants. And they were talking about opening this one kind of far outside of even Tapachula and out of the way, which was suspected to be specifically designed, to create invisibility, because they were actually bringing a lot of the media in, because they were making a lot of noise, which was the intention, to bring attention to their plight. They even marched through the city, and of course the National Guard came down and all that, which brought more media. And then when they realized that, they were like, well, our response is that we're going to open this new detention center. And then people were waiting for this, or excuse me, was it a detention center or a processing?
It was it's like a processing / detention center.
Yeah, and it wasn't really clear.
Get your exit papers.
Yeah, and it wasn't really clear, and they were saying that they were going to process people quicker, and allow them to do whatever was available to them, which was like a new policy of applying for permanent residence or something that would give them less of a chance of being able to apply for asylum at the border of the southern U.S. border. And then they were standing out there forever when we got there, trying to, and getting very restless and impatient, because you can only imagine the patience that you have to travel through several countries and see people die along the way, and experience violence and crime and such, and then get there and told that you even have to wait longer and be treated crazy with terrible racism and maltreatment and all of this, and then to be told to wait even more, and then from what I understand, the processing center didn't ever even open.
No, they never showed up. They literally didn't even have someone come out to say, psych. Yep. They just had those people waiting in the rain. They never showed up.
Yeah, so it was a big PR stunt that literally had no meat to it, had no substance to it.
And that's the situation they continue to be in. The Mexican government and other people continue to make promises about what's going to happen, and none of those promises come true. So it's like the pressure causes the Mexican government to do something, but the something has not been to actually honor people's human rights. And it's definitely going to take a lot more pressure and visibility of the problem to make that happen.
Okay.
And then the second piece, with respect to the local organizations, there are other orgs that are doing the work. We're not necessarily doing it all together. I know Haitian Bridge Alliance has folks that they are, that they have been, and that they are trying to see how they can help Haitian folks there who are not doing the same thing the African migrants are. So, and I meant to mention that in the beginning, the African migrants that we're talking about that have formed this assembly, they're the ones that are protesting, demonstrating, etc. We're not describing them as African in some kind of, xenophobic way. The Haitian migrants are not doing that. Like that, they have made a decision that that's not how they're rolling. They've been doing this trip since 2015, and they're going to continue to use the mechanisms that they've been using. But Haitian Bridge Alliance does a lot of work in Tijuana, and is also, in broadening or expanding its work in Tapachula. Alamahu African Dream is a new organization that started. We did a trip to Tijuana BAJI as Black Migrant Legal Support Network last December, and this attorney, Firebrand, Rebecca Alamahu, went with us. And on that trip, we saw all of these Eritreans, and that never had happened before. And so she connected up with them along with our staff attorney, Tsion Gurmu. They both were like pulling money out their own pockets and making sure that folks were helped in some way. And they formed this GoFundMe that has since turned into this organization. And again, Alamahu African Dream doing work, a lot of work in Tijuana, and beginning to do some work for Habesha folks in Tapachula. Obviously, BAJI, we, our base is Black folks who are immigrants. And so it's not necessarily limited to Haitians or Habesha folks. We cover the whole gamut, and we do work in Tijuana and Tapachula as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question. So it seems that they are primarily in need of political pressure to be applied to Mexico and the US to reinstate the humanitarian visa program so that they can transit Mexico as migrants were allowed to until earlier this year. Is that your understanding?
The issue is that it's not so helpful for them to have a humanitarian visa. What they need is an exit pass. They need a transit visa. A humanitarian visa, because let me go backwards. One of the things with this asylum ban is that you have to apply basically for humanitarian relief in these other countries first, in Central America, and then Mexico has made its own policy that you have to apply. Once you get that and you come to the let's say you get to the border and you apply, one of the questions that's going to be asked on the US side is, well, why don't you just stay in Mexico? They're already giving you humanitarian relief. What is it about Mexico? Why can't you stay there? Because if you can stay there, you don't need to get asylum in the United States. That's the setup. That's the whole point of these agreements, is to set people up to get asylum in these other countries so that the US can say, we don't want to have you here, even though you have an international human right and a US right under the law, right, separate from these executive orders, to have asylum or to ask for asylum in any country you want to. So they cannot, under international law, force you to accept asylum in Mexico or El Salvador, or Honduras or Guatemala, but that is what's happening. And so we actually are not asking, and they're not asking the African migrants for humanitarian visas. They're trying not to apply for those visas. What they want is a transit visa that allows them to transit through Mexico. And so that's what the press is.
Okay, thank you. The next question, did you meet anybody who had been returned under the migrant protection / persecution protocols to Mexico? I understand they are abusing people down there from the busing people down there from the northern border.
I personally did not meet anyone. So I can't answer whether that's happening or not. I haven't met anyone. We didn't have anyone that told us that, hey, that's what's happened to me. I know that, people did tell us that, hey, we tried to leave without any kind of exit visa or transit visa or humanitarian visa, and we got caught and we were set back here. I know that there's other detention centers that are smaller that are in the area that people are being sent back to or sent to if they get caught. But I don't know whether people who've made it all the way to the southern border of the United States are being sent all the way back to Tapachula. I don't know if that happens.
Thank you. The next question, how are Latino immigrant rights organizations serving this community?
Well, so there are groups that are involved. When I had gone down to Tapachula with a group called Refuge for Families, and there is a group, so two groups there, FIRM, Fair Immigration Reform Movement, and Alianza Americas, who are part of Refuge for Families. And so they invited me, FIRM invited me, Suma Arias, invited me to come down as BAJI, even though we're not, part of Refuge for Families, to see what was happening, specifically looking at Black migrants. And so when this happened, after I come back and we got the calls about what was happening with African migrants, I reached out to that group and said, hey, something's happening, what can we do? So I know that, FIRM was immediately, behind us and saying, hey, tell me what we need to do, Nana, and let's see how we can help. Alianza America's initial response was like, well, there's other migrants too. It's not just Black migrants, which you can tell by the tone of my voice. I didn't take that well, but they have since been on board. They're one of the signers on to the letters of support for the African Assembly and are, working to to be more of assistance and of support with respect to what's happening. And then in terms of other groups, we really haven't heard anything about other groups supporting kind of in an ally type of way. With respect to on the ground, that's not happening on the ground. Folks are not, Latinx immigrant rights organizations in the United States are not sending people on the ground to do on the ground work, which again is why it's so important that Black folks, organize ourselves to do that work to the degree that we have, even though we don't have the same capacity that Latinx immigrant rights groups have in terms of resources. We still got to make it happen per usual.
Okay, thank you. The next question, how can we organize to apply such political pressure in the United States?
Well, and I want to let Kendrick answer just, Kendrick, maybe you can give some ideas about ways that we're thinking about, sort of the videos, the social media platforms, like ways that we're thinking of hooking up that way, communications wise, how we spread the word. And then I can talk about some of the other pieces.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's really it. Amplifying their stories. We're trying to edit together a couple of videos that we want to get out there with some calls to action. And that's the main thing is, the great thing and the most annoying thing about social media is it bombards you all the time, but that's also the great thing about social media. So we want to bombard people with these stories because you have a lot of immigrant stories out there. There was just the documentary on Netflix, Living While Undocumented. I didn't see, no offense to anybody involved with that, but I didn't see any Black migrants included. They might be. I still have to watch it, but a lot of people still don't even know that Black people exist in Mexico, period, even though they've been there for hundreds of years. There are thriving communities down there, so my Cameroonian buddies here and Ethiopian and other first generation and immigrant people here in the United States don't even know that there are Black migrants in Mexico, and don't even know, a lot of Haitians don't know, that I've talked to, don't even know that there is a big community of Haitians in Tijuana. So there's still a cultural thing that needs to happen, storytelling element that needs to happen just in conversation, and making sure that people are aware and tweeting this stuff out and sharing the letter that the demand letter that the assembly put together. So sharing that and these videos and the video that you saw with Tsion and Nana, and then we also did an interview with NBC that is on my Instagram and I believe BAJI's Instagram, I think. And so you can share those. You can share any of the articles. I think Al Jazeera did AJ Plus, I think, did a piece on it, on what was happening in Tapachula and with the protests and the organizing that's going on down there. So just sharing as much as possible and putting pressure on some of these organizations like United We Dream and Raíces and some of those that are doing great work, but not as intersectional as we would like them to be all the time, making sure that they're including the work that's going on with the Black migrants and the treatment that is happening there, pressuring them, pressuring the government, pressuring international organizations to go and see what's happening and to speak out and help and to provide resources and legal help.
And we're trying, we are working on figuring out who the Mexican government is going to be most responsive to. And in terms of international organizations, some of the international organizations are, have taken the position, it appears, to, hey, African migrants, just follow the Mexican policy and apply here. And, it's Mexico's not so bad or whatever. And so really also we're doing some education for those orgs to have a better understanding of why African migrants are saying that they don't want to stay in Mexico, and how Mexico is not a safe country for them. It's not a safe country for many, but it's certainly not a safe country for African migrants. And so, doing some education as well as pressuring, and there's some additional letters and petitions that, we'll be doing. And again, if people just stay and, keep in contact, keep an eye out, you'll see those and the opportunity to help that way as well.
Thank you. The next question, thank you for bringing attention to this important issue. Do you know what are the main health issues faced by migrants in Tapachula, and what healthcare services do they have access to?
When we went, and again, Tiana's just come back, but when we went, most of the health issues are issues that have to do with like communicable diseases that you get from the inability to take care of yourself hygiene wise and sanitation wise in the ways that you would, that you would want to. Some have to do with like intestine, stomach stuff, because, people are eating food that's not culturally connected necessarily. Some of, obviously there's rice and other things, but there's also, people don't have the same access to the food that they normally eat that they might want. And, they don't have access necessarily to kitchens to do food and that kind of thing, even though there are the sisters that make food for the crew. But, you do have some intestinal issues, communicable disease issues. Some people have more serious issues that they've gotten from the journey and from the experience of the journey. But I think the biggest issue is mental health. And there's no way, when we talked to this brother from Ghana and he described what he saw crossing that jungle, when we talked to other folks about, they don't get to sleep, they've got to stay awake because there's poisonous snakes, there's creatures that eat people and all kinds of things. When you look in their eyes, when they're describing what they went through and seeing their comrades or people they started off with die in front of their eyes, people need mental health assistance. And, that's another area that would be really helpful. And if you don't speak the language, clearly, even if you had access to psychologists and counselors, you wouldn't be able to talk to them. And they don't have that kind of access. Access to healthcare has really been denied them in the detention center and outside of the detention center. I don't know if you have anything to add, Kendrick.
No, that's pretty clear. They were traumatized, so I don't think they're not done with their journey, so they're just focused on getting to the U.S. border. And to be clear, it's not necessarily, a lot of people think that they know what's best for these people more than they do, but we're amplifying their needs, their demands from their mouths. And so a lot of people asking them to stay in Mexico and assuming that that's a safer place is not a safe assumption. And it's not, these are, one of the reasons I wanted to travel down there is so bad to hear directly from them. And yeah, they've experienced, like I said, it's not the end of their journey, and they've already experienced so much trauma. They experienced enough trauma that they were willing to take their children and leave their homes, the only thing that they've known, which is, just think about what it would take for you to do that if you haven't experienced that already. And then amplify that times 5 billion after you arrive in Ecuador, and then have to travel through several countries and see people die along the way and experience even more tragedy and trauma, and then get there. And so then they haven't even, that's not even the end of their trauma, and acclimating to a new country, and hopefully finally making it in, and experiencing the racism from this government and from the Mexican government, and all of that. It's so, and they have to make it up from Tapachula all the way through Mexico. And Mexico is not a small country. It's a huge country. So yeah, there's a lot that they need in terms of medical assistance and sustenance and such. But there's also like a clear need, the biggest need, I agree, is mental health.
And I know that we need to end. We're now at 3:30, but I just wanted to end a little bit more on that point that Kendrick has made, because one of the hardest things for Kendrick and I were to hear people talking about all that they've been through, and they're looking at the United States like a clear glass of delicious water, and coming to the U.S. and being safe in the United States. This is what they're saying out of their own mouths, is like what had let them make it through the jungle, or what got them through the detention center experience, or what motivates them now and keeps them going. And to have someone say that to you, to have a sister from Angola say, I just want to get to the US so my children can be safe, me and my family can be safe, and we think about Botham Jean just recently. We think about this Cameroonian brother who died in custody in San Diego, in ICE custody, just yesterday. And it's like, of course, at the time, those things, Botham Jean had happened, but the Cameroonian brother hadn't passed. But, Kendrick and I looking at each other like, how do we tell these people who are saying, I can't wait to get to the United States where they honor human rights, where I'm not going to have to feel unsafe? How do we tell them that, no, bruh, no, sis, no, sibling? That's not quite true. It may not be like what you experience in your country, but you got 7 kids. I don't even know who's going to rent you an apartment. Like, how do we tell that? We didn't, but how do we look at that sister with her eyes full of hope and say, you're going to be worrying about every single one of those 7 kids and that husband and yourself every single day once you get to the United States? That part was, it's not about us at all, but that part was tough. Trying to figure out how to navigate those conversations, because we have a duty to have our people not, we have information, we need to share it, but figuring out how to share that information without squashing people's dreams. Not easy.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nana. I just want to take a minute to thank you and Kendrick for this really in-depth briefing on the crisis at the border. Do you guys have any final thoughts to close out?
I just want to thank everyone. Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Emanuela. Thank you so very much, Kendrick. Really appreciate you and all that you helped us with, and as we went to Tapachula and in Tapachula, and all that you've helped us with since, and just the work that you've done in general. And a thanks to all the folks that joined this webinar. Really appreciate your attention and your concern, and looking forward to working with you on behalf of our siblings in Mexico.
All right, well, we can just leave it at that. Thank you, everyone. Look out for an email by the end of the week with the PowerPoint and the video of this presentation. This webinar is part of our monthly policy webinar series, so watch out for the November webinar soon. And then if you have any questions, you can email us at info@baji.org. Please check out our website. We have a ton of resources and excellent reports on the state of Black immigrants. And below you can see our social media links. So thanks again, everyone. We had a wonderful turnout for this, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.